We will now look into some of the details of hosting Silverlight applications in SharePoint. Well, first off, we will cover some of the advantages. I'm sure you're aware that Silverlight is designed to provide a rich internet application development framework for you as a developer and a rich user experience for the users. Now, Silverlight for SharePoint can use the client object model to communicate with the server and retrieve data. And in a previous video, we discussed how this removes the need for you to build your own architecture. Now, an advantage that isn't particularly obvious is that Silverlight code is running in the browser, but has access to the .NET framework. So bear this in mind because you can create incredibly efficient applications that do not place a heavy load on the server simply by building user interfaces in Silverlight. So for example, you have access to XML readers and image classes and so forth from the .NET library. The same thing applies to how we interact with SharePoint data. We would typically batch up together a number of requests or a number of operations before we execute a query against SharePoint. So a lot of the processing can be deferred or pushed down to the client application, which will inevitably remove the load off SharePoint. Now here's an example of including a Silverlight application in a web part. Now we do of course have the built-in Silverlight web part that can point to a ZAP file, but from time to time you may need to create your own. So here we have an example of how to do that. We are literally building up a string that includes a div for placing our control and an object tag with a single parameter of name equals source that points to our ZAP file. Now there are a whole host of other parameters that you could provide, such as the error handling routines to use in the client, or maybe some initiation parameters should we need to pass data at initiation time from SharePoint to Silverlight. But this is the minimum that you actually need. What we do is build that string and then render it in a literal control, and our Silverlight application will be rendered automatically. Now the question arises of where you should deploy your ZAP file to. Well, typically, if you are deploying from Visual Studio, you may choose to deploy to one of the SharePoint root folders or particularly one of its subfolders, normally Client Bin, which is underneath Layouts. So that will ensure that your ZAP file is accessible from your SharePoint applications and your web parts, for example. But a ZAP file could easily be uploaded to a document library by an information worker, and it can still be rendered from there. It can be served up and rendered in the Silverlight Viewer web parts or your own web part. So that's a typical thing that an information worker may do. They may upload the ZAP file to a document library and then add the built-in Silverlight web part to a web part page and set its URL property to the ZAP file. And without any developer or administrator intervention, the information worker can enrich their SharePoint sites that way. Here's an example, very briefly, of rendering SharePoint files in the Silverlight UI so that we can make a richer user interface for SharePoint data. For example, at the top of my web part, I have a status bar that really does update in real time as we load files from a SharePoint document library. And then we render them in a video wall type configuration, so that's really rendering image files and videos. And the cool thing about this is that we could build up a whole wall of video files that are playing simultaneously. So that's the code you will see in one of the demos later in this module.